Thank you for that welcome, Jimmy, and I feel very daunted by following Jerry's very scholarly and very interesting paper on the legal side of things. On the 7th of March 1792, the Church of Scotland, Presbytery of Glasgow, agreed to petition Parliament in London to seek an end to the British slave trade. The proposer of the motion declared that the African slave trade is founded on cruelty and injustice and is carried on by methods inconsistent with the first principles of morality and religion, and called on Parliament to take every prudent and constitutional measure to break the yoke of oppression and abolish a traffic shocking to humanity. Now, when a court of the Church of Scotland, Kirk Session, Presbytery or General Assembly, agrees on something, it is the traditional right for anyone, and it still is, who in all conscience disagrees strongly, to record their dissent. On this occasion, the Minister of Campsie, the Reverend James Lapsley, rose to his feet. He argued that it was a dangerous decision that would foment public dissatisfaction with the government and incite a spirit of rebellion, which he claimed was all too common at this time. The old conservative chestnut about the church having no business to be involved in politics, and they really mean radical politics, and sticking to spiritual matters, was used. And Lapsley warned the ministers in the presbytery if they sent this petition, it would endanger their stipends, which depended on the profits of the city in trade and from landed interests. As has been made clear from historians writing about Thomas Muir, James Lapsley was a spy in the pay of the British government, willing to give evidence on anyone who advocated even mild reform on anything. Thomas Muir was not only an elder of the kirk in nearby Cadder, but as has already been mentioned, a very strong churchman, but he was also connected very with the Lapsley family, and they had in fact assisted James Lapsley in his education. And so this betrayal of the friendship and his acting as a witness for the government in Muir's trial the following year was one of the most blatant acts of treachery for money and position that one could find even in 18th century Scotland that did not lack examples of this. Fortunately, Lapsley's dissent was a lone voice that night in Presbytery, and despite heavy involvement in the slave trade and plantation slavery in Scotland, a fact really only acknowledged by historians in the last few decades, the petitions to end it showed that Scotland more than led the activities of abolitionists throughout Britain and Ireland. In 1792, of the 561 petitions sent to Parliament from Britain and Ireland, no less than 185 came from Scotland. One early historian of slavery, the late Duncan Rice of Aberdeen, wrote in his book, The Scots Abolitionists, 18th century Scotland is an extraordinary case of a small country that developed a heavy economic commitment to slavery at the same time when its intelligentsia were vehemently criticizing it. Actually, it was much more than the intelligentsia. But this evidence of a huge volume of protests is a curious omission on the part of many recent historians. Even as recently as 1975, when Sir Tom Devine wrote The Tobacco Lords about Glasgow's wealth from that product, there was scarcely a mention of who produced it. Now, this has totally changed in recent decades with the plethora of books and articles where many compete to bear our collective breasts over the evil of what has been undoubtedly one of the great crimes against humanity. But many are still reluctant to acknowledge the activities of Scots from all walks of life who raised voices and took action against it. Still more how few historians have been willing to acknowledge the role of theology, churchmen and churches in this crusade against the trade at the time of Thomas Muir, and later on against slavery itself. Perhaps for reasons of guilt, or perhaps because interest in the churches has declined in Scotland, but there's been a real airbrushing out of these roles. In 1778, one of the most landmark cases in Scotland's highest courts was determined on the issue of slavery. By a majority of judges in the Court of Session, they determined that the enslavement of people was not legal in Scotland, and that Sir John Wedderburn of Perthshire had no claim on the unpaid labour of Joseph Knight, whom he had brought from his estate in Jamaica. Lord Auchinleck, that's the father of James Boswell, who himself, Boswell was very, very strongly in favour of slavery, cast his vote in favour of Knight's freedom with these words: "Although in the plantations they have laid hold on poor blacks and made slaves of them, yet I do not think that it is agreeable to humanity, not to say to the Christian religion." Now, despite some popular misconceptions, slavery actually was never legally abolished in England's land until the 1834 abolition throughout the British Empire. 10 years after the Knight case, Scotland was a pioneer in the petitions in Britain to Parliament calling for abolition. And one of the first of these, in 1788, was from the Presbytery of Edinburgh, proposed by the Reverend Robert Walker of Canongate, who became an icon of Scottish art, immortalised by the painter Raeburn as the skating minister on Duddingston Loch. That year, although the Quakers were active in petitioning in England, Scotland's 16 ones all came from congregations, presbyteries, or synods of the Church of Scotland. And in the great petitioning year of 1792, whose volume forced Henry Dundas, perhaps the most powerful and prominent politician in Scotland, to agree to abolish the slave trade, but he cleverly gave no date and he reneged on his promise, nearly 100 Scottish petitions came from public meetings and citizens. The very action of ordinary people which Thomas Muir would certainly have supported. And the second most numerous came from Church of Scotland bodies. Even supposedly secular meetings were often held in church halls, and as often as not they were chaired by ministers, and their content was deeply rooted in arguments from faith. In the 3 legal cases of slavery before the Court of Session, the Knight one was the very final one, lawyers often cited biblical passages and made theological cases, a complete contrast to what was going on in the English courts. Whether baptism of enslaved people entitled them to be freed not just spiritually but physically has been summarily dismissed south of the border as having no relevance. But in Calvinist Scotland, it was a very live issue, and courts took that very seriously as a real question. In the petitions to end the trade, a number of themes were prominent. In almost all petitions, of course, the cruelty and inhumanity emphasis features strongly. But there were other arguments made which reflected the culture of Scotland versed in theological knowledge. St Andrew's Presbytery described the trade as repugnant to the principles of instinct and humanity and inconsistent with the genius of the Christian religion. From Hamilton came the clear statement that it was a direct violation of, quote, Jehovah's laws, that every man, nothing about women, should love his neighbour as himself. The country which saw education open to all by John Knox was exhibiting in public a very good grounding in the Bible. And interestingly, the dark concepts of judgment and divine wrath were very much found their ways into the appeals to Parliament. They reflected the idea of the slave trade not just being cruel, but also sinful and a violation of God's laws. Some of the strongest warnings were common that if the slave trade continued as a blot to in a Christian nation, then there would be dire divine consequences. The Incorporated Trades of Paisley, with 21 other societies, in their petition warned that the accumulation of national guilt and the barbarity of the West Indian slave owners cannot long escape the righteous judgment of God. Others, apart from the churches, warned of certain divine destruction. So despite Mr. Lapsley's objections, there are really no records of prominent Scottish churchmen at that time providing theological justification for the slave trade. This contrasted with many of the bishops in the Church of England and a notorious former priest, Raymond Harris, who was employed by the Liverpool merchants to write a pamphlet providing arguments to give theological validity to their actions of, quote, saving heathens from savagery. How you do that by making them slaves is another matter. On the contrary, the campaign in Parliament to abolish the slave trade made use of the work of several Scottish theologians in their campaign. William Wilberforce greatly admired Principal William Robertson of Edinburgh, whose sermons he requested and used in Parliament. He wanted to get a response to Harris from the Professor of Moral Philosophy in Marischal College, Aberdeen, James Beattie, who was very famous for his anti-slavery lectures that he delivered to students. Beattie declined, but another Scot took up the challenge. Those who have been celebrated as the pioneers in public life in the struggle against the trade and chattel slavery in the next century have invariably been based in London. Wilberforce, Granville Sharp, Thomas Fowell Buxton. These are the giants that historians have concentrated on. They're, of course, all men, and there were some women, and many of the enslaved leaders who, like the Scots, have been forgotten. James Stephen, the lawyer who was educated under Beattie in Aberdeen, like many young Scots at the time, Robert Burns included, planned to make a career in the West Indies. Seeing the reality of the institution at work, when he recognised it from Barbados, that it violated even a basic form of proper justice, Stephen, on his return, offered his services to Parliament. He was, in fact, a member of the House of Commons, and he drafted the bill that finally saw the abolition of the trade in 1807. Zachary Macaulay, son of a Highland minister, escaped to Jamaica, fleeing some misdemeanour, and through family connection obtained a post of bookkeeper, and that was a polite term for controlling enslaved Africans. At first he played the colonial game of accepting the cruelties, but eventually became sickened and returned to his sister in England, who had married an anti-slavery landowner and a friend of Wilberforce. After a tempestuous time as governor of the freed slave colony of Sierra Leone, Macaulay's most important work was as editor of the Anti-Slavery Reporter, a little bit like some of us remember the Anti-Apartheid News, which not only enlivened hundreds of committees through Britain, but provided through his painstaking research the ammunition for the fight in Parliament against the West Indian interests. Macaulay was no orator. His son was, Thomas Macaulay, the historian, but his work was deadly, and he was perhaps more hated even than Wilberforce by the West Indian merchants in Parliament, who tried, as always happens to whistleblowers, to find ways of dishing the dirt on him. The Reverend James Ramsay, Aberdonian missionary driven out of St. Kitts, was a valuable ally for the London campaign, because he was one who had seen the reality... James Ramsay had seen the reality of slavery at first hand, as did William Dixon from Dumfries. Now, Dixon had spent years as secretary to the governor of Barbados, and in 1792, Thomas Clarkson armed him with a whole lot of extracts of the House of Lords evidence on the slave trade. In the early part of that year, he traversed Scotland, including the north, presenting the facts in communities up and down, with perilous trouble. Imagine on a stagecoach between January and March in 1799 traversing Scotland. But he did that and presenting the facts, and he met with community leaders, mainly church ministers, but other community leaders, and asked them to respond to these facts. And his work undoubtedly hugely contributed to the number of petitions that year. And his 1792 diary in the Quaker Library in London is a fascinating document. But who's heard of William Dixon? And why have Stephen and Macaulay and Ramsay and him not had the same credit as the Wilberforces, Clarkstons and Buxtons? Now, at this point, it may be worth saying something about the distinction, and Jerry has gone into this very well, but between the two groups in the Church of Scotland, the moderate and the popular parties. As others writing about the churchmanship of Thomas Muir have pointed out, he and the notorious James Lapsley belonged to opposite sides. It used to be said that the Church of England's leadership was the Tory party at prayer. It maybe is a little bit unfair, but the Church of England, of course, is an established church with bishops in the House of Lords. The Church of Scotland, after the 1690 settlement, was recognised as a national church, but its General Assembly was supreme. But the controversy in the late 18th century until the formation of the Free Church halfway through the next one was, of course, on whether the Crown, through landowners, could appoint ministers, as was done in the Church of England. And the moderates, of course, were ones who supported the establishment, and the popular party were those who, by and large, disagreed with it. And, of course, Thomas Muir was part of the popular party. That's a very simple description. But in fact, what we have is attitudes to slavery did not reflect this division. Even if Lapsley was as near to defending the institution as any, and Muir was obviously, and we've heard much about his in the end, his sympathies as a man of the people would be opposed to slavery, but there were many traditional moderates that's passionately in support of abolition than their colleagues in the popular party. Once again, the theological appreciation had been part of the Scottish education so deeply and for so many centuries that this outweighed economic and political circumstances that might have divided quite equally cautious moderates and fiery populists. Macaulay, for example, was schooled into a traditional defence of the Protestant establishment, and he hated the idea of any kind of revolution, the idea of trades unions and Wilberforce. They were really very strong Tories. But one of his great heroes and allies was the Abbé Raynal, an ex-Catholic priest and indeed a member of the French Revolutionary Assembly, simply because Raynal worked relentlessly to get rid of the French slave trade, and that was the key one for Macaulay. In 1788, the Church of Scotland, through the General Assembly, declined to petition Parliament on the slave trade. The renowned moderate leader, Dr. Alexander Carlyle, argued that it was below the dignity of the Supreme Court of the National Church to petition Parliament. But he supported the strongest urging of the abolition of what he called a traffic contrary to the rights of mankind and the feelings of humanity in the Assembly's loyal address to the King that year, and that was agreed by the Assembly. I hope there will be more balance in future treatment of anti-slavery in Scotland from historians without diminishing the horrors of the crime. Some of the accounts of people such as Zachary Macaulay have been parodies. Simon Sharma, in his book Rough Crossings, conveniently tailors him to fit his own inadequately researched agenda by claiming he was a religious bigot who had no interest in humanity, which is absolute nonsense. But for me, the worst thing is not to have made unfounded comments like that. After all, history is interpretation and can bear the weird and the sloppy. It's the airbrushing out or the deliberate omission because it doesn't suit the preferred narrative of two very important elements close to Thomas Muir in his native land: the extensive challenging of the slave trade and later slavery, Scotland through individuals and corporate bodies in Scotland, and the part that the churches and those in the Christian tradition in Scotland did in the later years of the long 18th century in Britain. Of course, it was a complex number of factors which led to slavery's final abolition, often driven by economic factors such as Eric Williams, the Trinidad historian and politician, pointed out in his book in the 1940s, Capitalism and Slavery. Half a century later, in the city chambers in Glasgow, I and one of my fellow speakers here heard Nelson Mandela describe the same complexity which led to the ending of apartheid in South Africa. But he maintained that although that evil institution would have eventually collapsed, he paid tribute to the challenges to the system by countless individuals of goodwill, without which the evil would have survived much longer. I think there's a parallel here with the slave trade and with slavery. I rest my case.